really just a microcosm of the wider problem here. The argument that Toy Story 3 is a complete rehash of Toy Story 2 because of a laundry list of surface-level similarities, like they both open with a large-scale action sequence that's ultimately revealed to be an exaggeration of something fictitious. They both tackle the themes of mortality, change, and the idea that toys don't last forever. Both plots are kicked into motion by unwanted toys being gathered up outside and the main character ending up in the same location as those unwanted toys, at which point said main character winds up in a totally new environment with new characters and a twist villain. A delusional Buzz Lightyear locks up the main characters. There's an oversaturated flashback sequence involving abandonment, and the grand finale is a massive industrial contraption that results in the main villain being defeated and placed in the hands of an owner who has no care for their well-being. Now, I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I think that's a perfectly reasonable and fair summation of the events of these two films, which does not at all omit any context in order to make the arguments seem more reasonable than they actually are. I mean, it's not like there's an enormous difference between making peace with the concept of mortality and actually having to confront your mortality head-on when that moment finally arrives. It's not like saying the characters arrive in a new location with lots of new characters is such a laughable piece of evidence to use when arguing two movies have practically identical plots, as if the very idea of arriving somewhere new is itself some unforgivable sin. And Al's apartment as a new location is not inherently that interesting, and it's the drama that unfolds between the characters that's appealing, whereas the layout and backstory of Sunnyside directly play into the story alongside the compelling character drama. It's not like the Buzz opening consists of very specific setups for very specific payoffs that will happen in the future, with sneaking through the vents and route to Al's apartment being akin to Buzz's assault on Zurg's fortress, and the climactic battle against Zurg himself allowing Rex to finally accomplish in the real world what he never could in the virtual one, while the balls-to-the-walls fun western opening of Toy Story 3 instead looks to the past to call back to the earliest moments of playtime for the toys. It's not like you can't even begin to compare an adrenaline-fueled epic chase across the streets and through the inner workings of an airport to rescue Woody, where even though the toys are so small in the grand scheme of things, you still have everyone triumphantly taking charge and grabbing the danger by the reins to get everyone home safely, to a dire scramble for survival as it feels like the whole world is literally crumbling all around them as they can barely manage to cling on to life as they stumble their way over every obstacle thrown their way before ultimately being left with no options to the point of being forced to accept their death together as a family. It's also not like, yeah, no, I can't even pretend like this makes any sense at all. This argument holds absolutely no water whatsoever when you actually examine these two stories, and I'm so sick of seeing it be accepted as fact by some people, which is why I've spent so much time highlighting the critical contextual distinctions between things like the inclusion of a delusional Buzz, or the action set-piece opening sequence, or the villain, so I can at least attempt to repair the damage that was dealt to Toy Story 3 discourse when this criticism was first brought up over a decade ago, where people say that if you love Toy Story 3, what you secretly actually love is Toy Story 2 due to it just being a carbon copy of that movie. In order to make this argument, you have to be so ludicrously dishonest in how you represent these films, it's not even funny. When someone edits clips together that appear identical at first glance while pairing them with leading and omissive narration, it can very much seem like an open and shut case to any unassuming viewers, or people who haven't seen either movie in a while, or at all, but that's all they are. Surface-level similarities, some of which, if you'll recall, are things like characters are taken to a new location with a twist villain. It's like if I said, to name a totally random example, that The Lion King was nothing but a cheap ripoff of pre-1994 Kimba the White Lion content because their names are similar and they both have comic relief warthogs and angry bird sidekicks and villains with dark fur and a wounded left eye and themes about environmentalism and love interests and arcs for the main character about maturing into a confident ruler of the jungle. You know, fragmented surface-level similarities which immediately crumble to anybody who has actually watched and is paying attention to both pieces of media. Or if I said that The Matrix and the Lego Movie are actually the exact same film and Lord Miller totally ripped off the Wachowskis because they're both stories about a socially outcasted nerd going about their lives in what they believe to be a normal world but is actually a dystopian hellscape that will eventually bring about an apocalyptic doomsday, and who is believed to be the special special chosen one, prophesies to save them all, and subsequently teams up with a super cool woman whose competence far exceeds that of his own, undergoing psychological training in the hopes of rising up against the evil overlords and robotic Sentinel army, only to ultimately result in the most important members of the Resistance being restrained and held hostage for brainwashing before finally having a moment for the hero to come into his own and prove he is more than worthy of being the special person the prophecy spoke of. And also, they both got really, really terrible sequels. Now I ask you, is that a fair and honest summation of the Lego Movie and The Matrix? No, of course it isn't. That's the point. In case it isn't clear, I am not legitimately arguing that the Lego Movie ripped off The Matrix or that The Lion King ripped off Kimba. These are obviously absurd comparisons to make, and if you want to learn more on the Kimba front, you should check out this absolutely fantastic video on the topic made by YMS. I sincerely mean it when I say this is one of the best videos I've ever seen on YouTube, and I cannot possibly recommend it enough if you haven't already seen it because it goes into an extensive amount of detail and is armed to the teeth with countless supporting references about just how flimsy the accusations against The Lion King really are, and about how you don't get the same viewing experience from these two works of art, and that if you ignore all surrounding context and reduce their respective plot elements down to single-sentence descriptions, then yeah, you can make them sound pretty damn similar. I had to leave out a tremendous amount of context in order to summarize these two movies the way that I did, which is also what you have to do in order to argue that The Lion King ripped off Kimba, or that Toy Story 3 is a carbon copy of Toy Story 2. Even though you can very easily cherry-pick similarities between films such as The Lego Movie and The Matrix, you can't honestly argue that they are just the same story with different coats of paint because the circumstances of both films, the experience of watching both films, and the messages the writers wanted to get across to their audiences with both films couldn't be more dissimilar from one another. Though they may have a very similar premise, they end up focusing on separate elements that make each movie unique. And it's why I would even be willing to defend Cars against the accusation that it plagiarized Doc Hollywood, because even though it is inarguable that the two plots share a disturbing amount of overlap beyond the surface level, and I actually find it impossible to believe that Pixar just accidentally wrote a movie with such broad similarities given how weirdly specific this premise is, I also find it impossible to believe that someone could watch these two movies in their entirety and conclude that Cars is nothing but a shameless ripoff with nothing original to contribute, nothing unique to say, and nothing about its story that sets it apart from Doc Hollywood. But when you strip stories down to their skeletal structures and leave out all context surrounding each of those individual plot points that makes them categorically and demonstrably distinct from one another, you can describe just about any two movies in a way that makes them seem like carbon copies of each other. Vague, reductive plot summaries are not reflective of the things that make a story successful and resonant. People didn't love The Matrix for the same reasons they loved the Lego Movie. People didn't love well, Doc Hollywood has very different strengths than Cars does, and in terms of character and thematics, Toy Story 3 is not an explicit retread of old ground covered in Toy Story 2. For instance, the second movie places a far greater emphasis on the concept of value and self-worth, something Woody clearly lacks in the beginning of the story as he's frantically searching for his hat, believing Andy wouldn't want to take him to cowboy camp without it, and something which he and Jesse both embrace by the end, no longer needing to cling on to the path that was already written into stone for them or the words of a manipulative prospector just to give their lives meaning, but forging their own paths to happiness, with Woody understanding that the only one who can decide whether he still has value after Andy grows up is himself. That is an idea that is almost entirely exclusive to Toy Story 2, and when it comes to the thematic elements that do have more explicit overlap, Toy Story 3 just expands on what Toy Story 2 set up, which is what makes it such a great sequel and helps the trilogy feel like one huge story that was planned from the get-go, with one exploring the idea of facing your mortality, the question of how you can enjoy life when nothing in life lasts forever, and ultimately concluding that just because you know a song's gonna end at some point, that's no reason not to listen to it in the moment, while the sequel brings that conflict to its logical endpoint by confronting the inevitability Stinky Pete prophesized.
You'll all be ruined! forgotten, spending eternity rotting in some landfill.
And exploring what their lives are going to look like when the needle lifts for the last time. The world doesn't expand in the same way either, because a toy store, apartment, and airport serve different functions than a daycare and a landfill, which are both thematically bountiful places for a story about toys to be set. And narratively, Toy Story 2 is split into two halves, with an intimate character study in Woody's story and a high-octane comic relief rescue mission in Buzz's story, while Toy Story 3 is primarily an ensemble story that keeps the family together for most of the movie and focuses on their combined journey and experiences with Andy. And a decent chunk of Toy Story 3's second act is this elaborate prison break sequence for which there is no such counterpart in Toy Story 2. Do you see what I mean now? Because, like, I'm kind of running out of ways to say that Toy Story 3 is not a rehash of Toy Story 2. The stories aren't the same, the character arcs aren't the same, they do not offer you the same viewing experience with a different coat of paint beyond certain reductive comparisons, all of which are dramatically outweighed by their numerous differences. But of course, those would get in the way of the narrative that's being spun, so we wouldn't ever want to call attention to them. And there's an awfully annoying amount of irony in people saying, you all took this movie at face value without actually thinking about it because they dangled your childhood heroes in front of your face, only for people to then go on to take the incredibly slapdash arguments that the two movies are the same at face value, because as soon as you actually take the time to break down these two stories, it becomes abundantly clear that they serve very distinct purposes.